Konnichiwa minasan. O genki desu ka? Welcome to the advanced course of my channel. Let's learn Japanese with Eric. In this lesson, we will study how to form the passive conjugation or the rareru conjugation of Japanese verbs. Yoroshii desu ka? Hajimemashou. Consider the sentence. The students will eat the cake. This is what's considered an active sentence. We have the subject, the students, doing the action of eating the cake. The cake is our direct object, and our verb is will eat. Now in a passive sentence, the direct object now becomes our subject. The cake will be eaten by the students. The students now becomes by the students, and our verb now becomes will be eaten. Will be eaten is the passive conjugation, and we will learn how to make this, as well as make passive sentences in Japanese. Here are some more examples of passive sentences. The sushi was bought by Ms. Tanaka. The computers are made by Apple. In passive sentences, the focus is on the what would have been the direct object in an active sentence. The direct object has become the subject, and the word by, to denote the doer, is indicated in a Japanese sentence by the particles ni or niotte or kara. There are nuances to these three, as you will learn later, though ni is the most commonly used and you'll never go wrong using ni. First, let's learn how to conjugate verbs into their passive forms, such as will be eaten, was bought, and are made. Let's start with category 1 or ru-dropping verbs. For example, taberu, to eat, or will eat. You drop the ru and add rareru. So taberu will become Taberareru, will be eaten. The resulting verb is also the same as the shortcut ability, or the potential form that we learned in lesson 57. So Taberareru can also mean can eat. Which one it is depends on context. Taberareru is also a ru-dropping verb, and as such can conjugate just like any other ru-dropping verb into its 10 basic conjugations. And this is how Taberaremasu will conjugate into its basic 10 verb conjugations. Taberareru and taberaremasu mean will be eaten. Taberareta and taberaremashita mean was eaten. Taberarenai and taberaremasen mean will not be eaten. Taberarenakatta and taberaremasen deshita mean was not eaten. Te form is taberarete, and the conjunctive form is taberare. This means that you can form other conjugations with passive form, such as before, after, permission, prohibition, all those conjugations you've already learned, and we will see examples of this later. For category 2 or last hiragana changing verbs, here are the 9 kinds of verb endings: kugusu, bumunu, rutsu, and u. These endings change to the A series, turning to kagasa, bamana, rata, and wa. And to these verb endings, we add reru. The new verb now behaves like a category 1 or ru-dropping verb. Here's one example, the verb kaku, to write or will write. Change the ku ending to the A series and add reru. So kaku becomes kakareru, will be written, kakareru. And this is how kakareru conjugates into the basic 10. Kakareru, kakaremasu will be written. Kakareta and kakaremashita was written. Kakarenai and kakaremasen won't be written. Kakarenakatta, kakaremasen deshita was not written. Te form is kakarete, and the conjunctive form is kakare. As for the 5 commonly used irregular verbs, only suru, kuru, and iku participate in the passive conjugation. Aru and da cannot be used. Suru becomes sareru. For example, the verb benkyou suru, will study, becomes benkyou sareru, which means will be studied. Kuru becomes korareru, and iku becomes ikareru. All these new verb conjugations now behave as ru-dropping verbs during further conjugation. There are 2 kinds of passive sentences, direct passive and indirect passive. Let's look at them one by one. Let's look at direct passive sentences first. Direct passive uses active verbs turned into the passive form. Examples of active verbs are to eat, to drink, watch, open, close. These verbs can take a direct object. In a direct passive sentences, sometimes the doer is not known, and sometimes the indirect object for whom something is done becomes the subject or topic of the sentence. Here's our earlier example. The cake will be eaten by the children. To eat is taberu, and its passive form, taberareru, taberareru. The whole sentence in Japanese, keiki wa kodomo tachi ni taberareru. Keiki wa kodomo tachi ni taberareru. The cake will be eaten by the children. The focus is now on the cake and not the children. And the word by is indicated by the particle ni, kodomo tachi ni, by the children. The sushi was made by Miss Tanaka. Will make is tsukuru, a category 2 verb. Since we have was made, we conjugate into the passive past. Tsukurareta, tsukurareta. So the whole sentence is sushi wa Tanaka-san ni tsukurareta. Sushi wa Tanaka-san ni tsukurareta. Focus is on the sushi, and the doer, Tanaka-san, takes the particle ni. Next sentence, the iPhone was invented by Apple. To invent or will invent is hatsume suru. Again, we have a past tense passive, so we conjugate it to hatsume sareta. The whole sentence, iPhone wa Apple sha ni yotte hatsume sareta. iPhone wa Apple sha ni yotte hatsume sareta. Niotte means depends on, and when used in a passive sentence, suggests manipulation resulting in an effect, which is precisely what the verb hatsume suru, to invent, does. Niotte is also often used in formal speech and in writing. Another example, the Mona Lisa was painted by Da Vinci. To paint or will paint is egaku, and its past tense formal passive is egakaremashita. Using that in the whole sentence, Mona Lisa wa Da Vinci ni yotte egakaremashita. Mona Lisa wa Da Vinci ni yotte egakaremashita. We use niotte again to emphasize that the genius Da Vinci manipulated the Mona Lisa to be the masterpiece it is. This next example shows when it's necessary to use the particle kara to indicate the doer. The sentence, the recipe is passed on by the mother to the daughter. We have the doer, the mother, and a recipient, the daughter. Both would typically use the particle ni. However, when translated to Japanese, there's now no way of knowing whether the doer is the mom or it's now the daughter. Therefore, we need to use kara for the doer. And the sentence rewords to, the recipe is passed on from the mom to the daughter. The verb to orally pass on something is tsutaeru, and its passive form is tsutaerareru. So the whole sentence in Japanese becomes, recipe wa okaa-san kara musume-san ni tsutaerareru. Recipe wa okaa-san kara musume-san ni tsutaerareru. Now it's no longer confusing. Same case in this sentence. The change was handed over by the waitress to the customer. We have a doer, the waitress, and a recipient, the customer. And to distinguish the doer from the recipient in the Japanese sense, we assign the particle kara to the waitress and the particle ni to the recipient, denoting the direction of the action from the waitress to the customer. To hand over is watasu, and its passive past tense formal is watasaremashita. And so the Japanese sentence becomes, otsuri wa waitress-san kara okyakusama ni watasaremashita. Otsuri wa waitress-san kara okyakusama ni watasaremashita. Now in some cases, the indirect object becomes the subject of the passive sentence. Now just to jog your memory, the indirect object is for whom something is done in the sentence. And in our example here, that is the customer. So our new sentence now becomes, the customer was handed the change by the waitress. And in this construction, the waitress can now also take the particle ni again. And our sentence, Okyakusama wa waitress-san ni otsuri o watasaremashita. Okyakusama wa waitress-san ni otsuri o watasaremashita. Since there is only one ni in the sentence, there's no conflict as to who the doer is. Sometimes the doer of the action is unknown, like in news reports, so the passive sentence is very useful. For example, the money was stolen. There's really no other way to report it because we often don't know who the thief is. To steal or will steal is nusumu. Past tense passive is nusumareta, nusumareta. And so the whole sentence, okane wa nusumareta, okane wa nusumareta. You often hear this in the news. Here's another one you frequently hear, unfortunately. The man was killed. Often when it's reported in the news, they don't know who the murderer is yet, so the passive construction is the only way to report it for now. To kill or will kill is korosu. Past tense passive is korosareta, korosareta. And so the whole sentence, otoko wa korosareta, otoko wa korosareta. The man was killed. Next is indirect passive. The whole idea in an indirect passive sentence, or also known as the suffering passive, is that someone did something to a person and that caused that person to be upset. The subject of the sentence is the victim of that suffering. And in a suffering passive sentence, the verb can originally be transitive or intransitive. Let's look at some examples. 私たちは昨日雨に降られた。私たちは昨日雨に降られた。Our victim, as indicated by the particle wa, is 私たち or we. Our perpetrator or doer is 雨に or the rain. And our passive verb form is 降られた, which comes from 降る, which means to rain. 降る is an intransitive verb. So the whole sentence translates to, yesterday we got rained on. And the nuance here is we were not happy. Well, no one wants to get caught in the rain, right? Next example. 彼女は去年ご主人に死なれた。彼女は去年ご主人に死なれた。Our victim is 彼女 or she. Our doer is ご主人 or her husband. And our passive verb is 死なれた, which comes from 死ぬ, to die. An intransitive verb. So what did the perpetrator do? He died on her. Translation, she had her husband die on her last year, and that caused her to be unhappy. You can also simply say that her husband died last year, but with a passive sentence, that suffering and sadness gets conveyed. 私は弟にピザを食べられた。私は弟にピザを食べられた。I am the victim, watashi. Perpetrator is my younger brother, ototo. And the passive verb is taberareta, which comes from taberu, will eat, a transitive verb. So translation, my brother ate my pizza and I'm upset. Mariko wa okaasan ni denki o kesaremashita. Mariko wa okaasan ni denki o kesaremashita. The victim is Mariko. The perpetrator is okaasan or Mariko's mom. And the passive verb is kesaremashita, which comes from kesu, will erase. It's a transitive verb. So the whole sentence translates to Mariko's mom switched off the lights and that upset Mariko. So maybe it was bedtime. Shimada-san wa okusan ni yasuppoi kutsu o kawareta. Shimada-san wa okusan ni yasuppoi kutsu o kawareta. The victim is Shimada-san. Perpetrator is his wife, okusan ni. And the passive form verb is kawareta, which comes from kau, meaning to buy or will buy. Kawareta means was bought. And the whole sentence translates to, Mr. Shimada's wife bought him cheap-looking shoes and he's not happy about it. Now the suffering passive construction isn't always a sad ending. It can also be a happy one. For example, Taro-kun wa tonari ni kirei na onna ni suwararete niko-niko shita. Taro-kun wa tonari ni kirei na onna ni suwararete nico nico shita. Nico nico shita means to have been smiling. So the happy victim is Taro-kun and the perpetrator is kirei na onna, or a beautiful girl. And what did the perpetrator do? Our passive form verb is suwararete, which comes from suwaru, meaning to sit down. And so translation, a beautiful girl sat next to Taro and he smiled, meaning he was happy she sat beside him. Now the passive form, when used in a regular sentence construction, converts the sentence into an honorific one. We use honorific language when speaking with a superior, customer, teacher, or people socially higher than ourselves. For example, sensei wa kokuban ni kakaremashita. Sensei wa kokuban ni kakaremashita. This is a regular sentence construction, except for the verb which is in the passive, so this must be an honorific sentence. Translation, the professor wrote on the board. We use honorific language to refer to the professor. Now the passive interpretation does not make sense because it doesn't make sense to say the professor was written by the blackboard. It's impossible. So the only other possibility is the honorific. The professor wrote on the board. Another example, Party ni ikaremasu ka? Party ni ikaremasu ka? Our verb here is ikaremasu. Honorific. Translation, will you go to the party? This is when you ask, for example, your boss, are you going to the party? It has to be honorific because the passive interpretation doesn't make sense. Will you be gone by the party? So the only other meaning is, will you go to the party? Honorific. Now the passive form can sometimes be ambiguous. Is it honorific? Is it passive? Is it shortcut ability if the verb is a category 1 root-dropping verb? So it all depends on context and the other elements in the sentence, whether there's a direct object and so on, to be able to figure out the meaning. For example, this sentence, Shachou wa sushi o taberaremashita. Shachou wa sushi o taberaremashita. The verb is taberaremashita. Now, if this were a shortcut ability conjugation, the sentence translates to, the company president was able to eat sushi. If this were honorific, it translates to, the honorable company president ate sushi. And if this were suffering passive, the sentence translates to, somebody ate the company's president sushi and he got upset. Now comes the exciting part. The passive form can combine with other conjugations that you've already learned in past lessons to add dimension to what you want to say. Boku wa kimi ni iwaretaku nai yo. Boku wa kimi ni iwaretaku nai yo. The subject is boku or I, and the doer is kimi or you. Our verb is iwaretaku nai, which comes from the verb you, meaning to say or will say. And when that's converted to passive, it becomes V-areru, will be said. And when conjugated with takunai, meaning don't want to do, which we learned in lesson 47, we get iwaretakunai. And so the translation of the whole sentence, I don't want to be told by you, you know. And the don't want to be told portion is iwaretakunai. Next example, Boku wa minna ni waruku omowarete mo heiki da. Boku wa minna ni waruku omowarete mo heiki da. Our subject is boku or I, and the doer is minna or everyone. The passive form verb is omowarete mo, which comes from the verb omo, to think or will think. Converted to passive, omowareru, will be thought of. And that is conjugated for even if or temo, a conjugation we learned in lesson 50. Omowaretemo, even if thought of. So the whole sentence translates to, even if I'm thought of badly by others, no sweat, I don't mind. Yobaretara kimasu ka? Yobaretara kimasu ka? This is a question, so the default topic is you, the listener. Our verb in the passive is yobaretara, which comes from the verb yobu, meaning to call or will call. Conjugated for passive, V-areru, will be called. And conjugated for conditional if, using tara, we get yobaretara, if you are called. So the translation of the sentence is, if you're called, will you come? Next example, Kimi wa warawarete mo ii desu ka? Kimi wa warawarete mo ii desu ka? We have the subject kimi meaning you, and the passive verb is warawarete mo ii, which is from warao meaning to laugh or will laugh. Passive is varareru, will be laughed at, and we conjugate this for permission, varawarete mo ii, which we learned in lesson 37. So the whole sentence translates to, are you okay being laughed at? Next example, suterareta hon wa doko desu ka? Suterareta hon wa doko desu ka? We have a passive form verb, suterareta, nominalized by a noun, hon or book. You can review nominalization with nouns in lesson 43. Suterareta comes from suteru, an active verb meaning throw. That converts to suterareru, will be thrown, then conjugated for past tense and put before a noun, hon, suterareta hon, the book that was thrown away. So the whole sentence translates to, where is the book that was thrown out? Our last example, 彼はカンニングしたのを先生に見られてしまった。彼はカンニングしたのを先生に見られてしまった。We have the subject he, the doer, sensei or teacher, and the passive form verb is 見られてしまった, which comes from the active verb 見る, meaning will see. Passive form 見られる, will be seen, and we conjugate for regret with しまう, which we learned in lesson 42. Past tense しまった, 見られてしまった was unfortunately seen. And what was unfortunately seen? カンニングしたの, that he was cheating in class. To cheat in a test in Japanese is カンニングする, likely coming from the English adjective cunning. And that whole verb phrase is nominalized by the particle no. And you can review nominalization with no and koto in lesson 44. So the whole sentence translates to, he was unfortunately seen cheating by the teacher. To summarize, the passive form is used when emphasis is on the direct object. For example, the sushi was made by Tanaka. Sushi wa Tanaka-san ni tsukurareta. Emphasis is on the sushi. The passive form is also used when the doer is not important or unknown, which is frequently the case in news reporting. For example, 1 million yen was stolen. 100万円が盗まれた. And we don't know who stole it. There are two kinds of passive sentences. We have the direct passive, which uses only transitive verbs conjugated into the passive, such as the sentences above. And we have the indirect passive, which is also known as the suffering passive. Indirect passive sentences can use verbs that are transitive or intransitive. The idea of the suffering passive is when someone does something to a person, causing that person to be upset. Example, 僕は彼に寿司を食べられた. Taberu, a transitive verb, is conjugated into the passive. And the sentence means, he ate my sushi and now I'm upset. Another example, this time using an intransitive verb, is 昨日雨に降られた. I got rained on yesterday. The passive form for category 1 verbs is the same conjugation used for ability, as we learned in lesson 57. For example, the verb neru, to sleep. Neraremashita ka means, were you able to sleep? It's shortcut ability conjugation. The passive form in regular sentence construction turns the sentence into an honorific. Example, the verb iku, to go. Tokyo ni ikaremasu ka? Will you go to Tokyo? It's an honorific, such as when asking your boss. So that ends our lesson on the passive conjugation. Our next lesson is on the causative conjugation. See you then. Otsukaresama deshita. If you're serious about becoming fluent in Japanese, it's important to practice daily, learn grammar, and build up vocabulary. My whole course is designed to give you a strong basic foundation in the Japanese language that you can build solidly upon. So please click like, share, or subscribe and watch the next video in the series. 日本語の勉強に頑張ってください。じゃあ、またね。